Hey guys, what's going on? I'm back at the Soundscape and I wanted to test out some new gear. Not exactly ready to test out this gear, but you know, kind of excited. Anyhow, doing a mix for a really kick-ass band from late 90s, early 2000s called Too Fat and the Family Function. This is some live material that was recorded at a local bar that was located downriver, and it was called Floyd's. Pretty cool place. Probably didn't hear much about it, but let's check it out. Let's see what we got. I'll cue something up here. I also thought maybe I could give everybody a quick tour of the studio while I'm just hanging out doing nothing. I should also mention that the summer classes are 100% filled. That's right, 100% filled. The Complete Studio Engineering State License class is filled for the summer, which is scheduled to begin the second week of June. I'll also mention that we've already begun registering new students for the fall, which is scheduled to begin the first week of October. So if you want to get involved in one of these awesome state license recording and mixing arts classes, you better give us a call right away. We'd love to have you, and I think you'd really enjoy the class. So let's check some of this out, and I'll also, like I said, give you a quick tour of the studio. Right now, I'm using one of my personal favorite programs. We do run Pro Tools, but we also run Nuendo, Steinberg Nuendo, which is one of my favorite software DAWs to use. There really isn't a huge difference between this and Pro Tools. Keep in mind that the sound quality does not come from your DAW. Essentially, it's going to come from things like your interface or your analog to digital converters, whichever you want to call it. Right now, we're using the Lynx Aurora 16. We have two of those running back to back, 32 channels of high-grade mastering audio conversion. See if I can find a cool track here for us to listen to. I should also mention that this show that I've loaded up here that I'm mixing was hosted by some really cool dudes from a really great local radio station in Dearborn. The program was called The Zone, and Origix in DC, super cool dudes. I'm sure you probably have heard of those guys. They've been enormous supporters of the local music community. Not just the genre that they're favorable of, which would be hip hop, rap, that sort of thing, but just pretty much everything. Those guys are awesome. And they did host this show. I can't remember the exact date, but it was really cool to have those guys host the show. Let's see if we can get any of that on audio here for our playback. So Origix or DC, if you guys are checking this out, drop a line in the messages and tell me if you remember this show. I imagine you probably do. There we go.
Like, you know, to really get out here and to be somebody, you got to come out here and really put all your heart into it. And from everything
it's got a lot of static.
Day one, this dude is serious. This guy brings out the whole sound. He gets the t-shirts. He promotes. This guy stays grinding. He does not give a damn. He's been doing since like the mid-90s. He's been out here. Word to see lit. What up, DC?
You can't forget he opens a can of whoop ass on your mama.
Yeah, he pushed that CD hard. He got it back right now. Open a can of whoop ass on your mama. And his
Super mental.
And he got a new CD dropping soon. So I mean, support. He's recording all this live. So you know, live.
So we don't have to listen to all that, but a trip down memory lane, right? This was the album Opening a Can of Whoop Ass on Your Mom's, and it was distributed by Mark Kemp and his distribution company, which I believe is still around, Long Range Distribution. The album was nominated for several Detroit Music Awards a couple years in a row, actually. Let's see if I can find a good tune on here for us to sample. Bear with me. Here we go. Here's a cool track.
Watch out, get up and dance. It's like testing, 1, 2, 3. What you gonna do? Jump out that tree? You know, stick with the bad boy. You never play that shit. Say what you can't hear me. What you say? You a rapper? I'm hurt better than the next night with my clapper. I got one fish, two fish. You a two fish.
Obviously, it's unmixed. I loaded up a bunch of WAV files, and that's the great thing about digital, right? I mean, a couple weeks ago, I loaded up a bunch of analog tapes to transfer for another project, and unfortunately, a lot of the analog tape was just falling apart, and unfortunately, a lot of the information was falling off of the tape, so it wasn't playing properly. But something like this with digital WAV files, I mean, geez, this is from easily 2004, maybe 2003, I have no idea. But it still sounds the same. There's no difference. It's all individual tracks. Everything needs to be mixed, but it's pretty cool, you know? We got everything that we started with then. So anyhow, I'm in the control room right now, and we've got some really cool gear that I am privy to. Those of you who know me know that I like to pick out a lot of unique pieces of gear. I don't really want to have what everybody else has. I'd like to have pieces of gear that have character and create some type of personality, because I know that my clients are unique, and they're obviously going to have their own character and sound involved in the product that they're bringing in here. I want to add my stamp to it, and I don't want to necessarily just have something that's super clean. I want to have something with a lot of personality. So let's talk about some of the stuff that I have. As far as the preamps go, I'm using a collection of API 512 preamps. Those were used a lot by Van Halen, Eddie Van Halen. He really liked the API 512s because they added the color that he was looking for in the guitar tones. Now, I use them a lot on drums. They're very mid-range forward and super punchy. I love the way they sound. They're really loud. And this is from the API Lunchbox. That's what I'm using. So the API 512. I'm also using, and you got to forgive me, I'm looking over here. I'm also using a handful of the Vintech 573s. Which I really, really like. Great company. They're from Florida. Super cool dudes. And the gear, the API, I'm sorry, the Vintech 573s are a lot like the Neve 1073s. So I started buying those early on because, to be honest, I couldn't afford the Neve stuff. But they sound so good equally on their own. I certainly wouldn't say they're a Neve pre, but they have that color. They're really warm. So then I also have a handful of Neve 1073 preamps now, and I love those equally as well. Those are awesome preamps. They sound great, super warm and big sounding, and you know, they're appropriate for certain stuff, but not for everything. I've recently started adding some Cappy preamps. I've got the Cappy VP28s. And they sound really awesome too. They're very similar to the API 512s, definitely cheaper. And I like them because they're a lot more versatile than the 512s, like what API offers. More recently, I brought in Sphere Fab 500 preamps, and these are a cross between the API 512s and the Neve 1073s. So the APIs are very mid-range forward, lots of detail, lots of punch, and the Neve are really warm and big sounding. And these are a nice balance between the two, and I gotta be honest, they sound freaking amazing. I'm beyond excited about them. They're so nice sounding. Great company if you get a chance to check them out, Sphere. These particular preamps were essentially the preamps that were used during some Marvin Gaye recordings, Rolling Stone recordings, so they've got some history. They sound really, really nice. So those are the main preamps that I'm using on the front end of the system here at the Soundscape Recording Studio in Royal Oak. Additionally, I'm definitely into plugins, but I really, really like hardware. So I want to use pieces of gear that are the real thing. Let's check out some of this stuff. I'm just going to turn the camera here and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of this stuff here. So we have down here, we've got this TK Audio BC1. This is, a lot of people say it's very close to a SSL mix bus compressor. So it's a stereo bus compressor. It sounds fantastic. I really, really like it. It's really clean. It doesn't have a lot of color that it adds to it, but it does exactly what I want. I tend to use it on my mix bus almost 95% of the time for sure. Below that, you see I've got the Dangerous D-Box here, and I did a video a few weeks ago where I was using this summing mixer to sum everything in the software. Instead of using the digital mix bus, I was using the summing mixer here in place of that. So above that, I've got these DBX 160As. I think these are good bang for your buck. They're not super crazy expensive, and they're very nice sounding. They've got a lot of personality to them if you push them really hard, but if you don't, then they really just kind of do what you want and they're clean. I like to use them on, you know, different things like voiceovers, for example, and drums. This up here is the Studio Technologies AN2 Stereo Simulator. This is a, essentially, I can add a stereo width to something that's mono, which I got the idea from one of my favorite mixers. Her name is Sylvia Massey, and I'm inspired by a lot of different engineers out there, and she's probably one of my absolute favorite. But I saw somewhere that she was using this Studio Technologies AN2 Stereo Simulator on vocals, and I thought, wow, that's really cool that she would do that to the vocals to widen the vocals, because to me, I always felt like vocals in the commercial mixes always sounded wider than what I was getting. And that's when I stumbled upon that little secret. So I started using that, and the vocals sound super big now. So pretty sweet. Anyhow, I've got some other stuff over here. Let's take a quick look. I've got a pair of 1176s. These are the Universal Audio version, still equally as great. You know, these are the classics. I've got a pair of them. They both sound a little bit different. They both don't sound exactly the same, but they do exactly what I want. Of course, they're very aggressive. I love them on drums, love them on vocals, love them on lots of stuff. So this is some of my other compressors, along with my TK Audio and the DBX 160As we have now. These Universal Audio 1176s. I also have another compressor right up here that I didn't mention. It's a pair 1066 compressor limiter gate made by DBX, which is absolutely worth it too if you're just needing something clean. Maybe you want to compress a bass DI and a bass mic signal at the same time, and you want to use the same compressor because you want to ensure that you keep them in phase. That's a good one to go with. I also have a couple other pieces of gear here. I've got this Yamaha SPX 90, which is a super favorite of mine. I've got it on patch number 15, which is symphonic. This is what Andy Wallace used for the Nirvana Nevermind record when he was processing Chris Novoselic's bass tones. So if you listen to the bass tones on that record, you're going to hear this symphonic kind of characteristic over the bass sound, and that's where it came from. It's actually that particular patch on the Yamaha SPX 90. I love that thing. It sounds badass. Below that, we've got a Tapco 4400A spring reverb. I have just a few outboard reverbs, and this is one of my favorite. I really enjoy spring reverbs. Below that, I've got this Hardkey Transient Attack 3500 MOSFET bass head, which I really like to use on bass. It's one of several pieces of gear that I will tend to use for bass. Of course, there's bass players that bring their own gear in, and I want to start there. Below that, I've got this Hughes SRS. Let me see if I can get it in the view here, if you guys are seeing it. It's a Hughes at the bottom here, Hughes SRS sound retrieval system. This is another stereo widener like the Studio Technologies AN2. I'm really into widening sounds. I'm really into tall, deep, and wide mixes. That's what I've always been taught. That's how I was trained. That's how I mix. I realize that if you want to compete with what's happening out there, you have to make mixes that are larger than life. And using machines like that, pieces of gear, to me, will give you that sound. And of course, you can find this stuff with the plugins too. But there's just something about the hardware that has more appeal to me. There's just something about it. It doesn't sound bottlenecked. When it's going through the software, it's always tighter. It's always bottlenecked. When I go through the hardware, it's for real. It's in my face, I've got some other gear over here on the next rack. This is one of my favorite pieces of gear. This is the Retro Stay Level compressor. I love that compressor. It's a tube compressor. It sounds amazing. As you can see, I really like compressors, so I have a lot of compressors here. I've got this Warm Audio. It's a Pultec ripoff, if you will. It's a tube equalizer. It sounds equally amazing with some of my other pieces of gear as far as bass goes. So this is definitely something I would use on the bass. I skipped one up here. I guess I should turn back. This is a vocoder, an actual hardware vocoder made by Warp Factory. I'm sorry, made by Electrics. It's called the Warp Factory. And I bought this because at the time I was working with a lot of heavy metal bands. And I can't remember who the engineer was that I was following at the time, but he was talking about how there's a noise mix. He didn't actually use the vocoder per se on this piece of gear. He just used this noise additive that it had on here, and it sounds great. And he would add it to the vocals to create this grungy kind of like space around the vocals, and it sounded freaking badass. So anyways, I've been using it too, and I gotta say I love it. Now I use it on all kinds of crazy stuff, man. I'll use it on snare drums, and it sounds super cool. And again, I'm not using the vocoder aspect, I'm just using the noise mix. We have some other EQs and stuff over here that actually aren't hooked up, but up here, I've got a pretty cool, sorry about that, mic. Over here, I've got another pretty cool piece of gear. This is the Acme Motown DI. This was what James Jamerson was using on all the old Motown stuff. This thing sounds badass for sure. And whenever I'm not using this, I use that Hardkey MOSFET. And I almost always go through that Warm Audio Pultec type EQ just because it just sounds totally great. So let's take a quick walk around the studio. This is the control room here, and we're looking at essentially where myself or one of my engineers are typically running the show, if you will. Out here in the live room, you can see it sounds a lot different when I'm out here. Some of you have been here, of course, because you've cut records here, or maybe you've come down to some of our annual Halloween parties, or maybe you've been a student here at the Soundscape Recording Studio. So you're going to recognize the images that I'm showing here in the live room. We have a beautiful Detroit-made Baby Grand, Leonard Detroit. It sounds fantastic, I got to tell you. And it's a beautiful piece of gear. This was made in Detroit, so can't get better than that, right? I mean, Detroit's where it's at. I've got a nice drum kit over here. We've had lots of different drum kits in the studio, but I got to say that this is one of my favorite. We've had Yamaha, DW, Detroit Custom Drums. I don't even remember all of them, to be honest, but this one is made by Crush, and it sounds fantastic. It's a birch shell, which I really, really like. It's got a lot of mid-range, lots of punch. It's loud, but it's not too loud. It's the right volume for this room, and it works out very nicely. Looking around in this room, you'll see some of the wall diffusion that we've got going on here. You can see it on this wall over here. This stuff here, all this pegboard looking stuff on the walls. If you've ever taken a tour through the Motown recording studio in Detroit, then you've probably seen something like this. This stuff was designed to create diffusion in the room to help control the sound, to tune the room, so to speak, like you would tune a stereo with your bass, mids, and trebles. One time I took a tour through there and I saw how they were doing it, and they actually had everything going horizontally. And I thought, man, that's a really inexpensive way to create some room diffusion. So, you know, I stole it. I stole the idea, I admit it. Let's walk through here. We've got the rest of the studio here. We've got, right back here, we've got our vocal room, super dry. This is the way that I prefer to have this room. It's a pretty dead sound. It's tuned up. It's not like a square room. It's not a rectangle room. It's got some nice angles in here and a nice tall ceiling, which is super helpful. And we've got some acoustic treatment above the ceiling here to help absorb certain tones, lower mid-range stuff, just to trap things, basically. We don't have any particular microphone set up in here today because we generally keep all our mics in our mic locker, and we take out what mics are necessary at that particular time. So we don't have anything in here right now. But regardless, this is the vocal room. This is where people sing. But to be honest, I've had people play a saxophone in here and it sounds fantastic. Guitar amps sound great too. Really, this is the dry room, and that out there, that's the wet room. What do you need? A wet sound or a dry sound, right? Back in here, we've got the offices, and then we also have a amp isolation room back in here. We will isolate amps in different rooms, but this is one room that we'll definitely isolate amps in. All of our rooms are cabled up, so we could basically throw an amp in the bathroom if we really wanted to, and get that sound if that's what we were going for. We could put an amp. Essentially, we're set up to put an amp anywhere we want. We could probably even, well, I know there's bands that could tell you about dragging amplifiers outside even. I'm not afraid to do anything. You want to record the drums out in the middle of Rochester Road? Let's go for it. We'll put some cones out there. You know, maybe we'll get hit by a car. Anyhow, I hope you enjoyed the tour. I know it was a long one, but you know what? I was bored. I've got nothing else to do. I can't even get a haircut. I'll talk to you next time.